You were there, right? Nobody else was throughout your entire life. You've been there the whole time. We can't even comprehend that. We can't even remember that. But guess who can? God. God can. God was there the first day. He was able to look at it. He was there even before that, before the first time you opened up your eyes. That God has been there to know every time you've gotten up, every time you've sat down. Let's look at the verse. We'll see is the omniscience. The first thing we see is this truth. Thou hast searched me and known me. Actually, that phrase that's in there, has searched me and known me. Actually, turn to Genesis chapter 16, sorry. We're not going to jump around too much today, but Genesis chapter 16. In verse 13, we actually see that same phrase is used with a woman named Hagar. Anybody remember who Hagar was? Yeah, Abraham's, it was Sarah's maid servant. And that was who Abraham had laid with when God had given him this promise. And Abraham didn't believe God. He got impatient and laid with Hagar and had Ishmael. And Sarah found out and ran Hagar off. And God came into Hagar. It says, and the angel of the Lord in verse 7 found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur, and said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, whence comest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, return to thy mistress, and submit thyself unto her hands. And the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard thy affliction. And he shall be a wild man, and will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord, and spake unto her, Thou God, seest me. For, said she, have I also here looked after him that seeth me? He said that phrase, thou God seest me. See here, God was giving Hagar blessing, right? The very first part of that, what did he promise her? You're going to have a son, right? And he's going to have a multitude, right? You're going to have a multitude of descendants. He's making a people of Ishmael. Who do we know the people of Ishmael became? The Arabs, the Arab nations came of Ishmael. And so we see that Hagar was, she was rejected. I mean, she was cast out. She was afraid she wasn't going to survive. And here, what has God given her? He looked favorably on her. He cared for her. He gave mercy to her, right? And he didn't just give mercy to her, but he blessed her. And she says, what? Thou God seest me. We see God actually named Ishmael. You know what Ishmael means? God has heard. The idea that we often see Ishmael, we kind of say, we read that second verse and we say, and he will be a wild man and his hand shall be against every man. And we think, man, what kind of blessing is that? What kind of blessing is it to be known that your son is going to be wild and be fighting every person he can find? But to Hagar, it was a blessing to know that she was going to have a child, that she was going to survive, that there was some kind of blessing there. So we see that same phrase, thou hast seen me, is that same phrase that David says, thou hast searched me and known me. You see, David understood that God was looking upon him, that God had seen his substance. And we'll look at that in a little bit later. He talks about that, that God had seen his substance and had mercy upon him, despite all that God knew about him. God knew that Hagar knew that she didn't have any status or anything, but she knew that God had seen her and taken care of her. Look at verse 2. Thou knowest my sitting down and my uprising. Thou understoodest my thoughts afar off. You see, God understands the first part of that. God understands our movements. He knows my sitting down and my uprising. You think about, when you apply for a job, what do you typically share on your resume? What do you typically share on your resume? All your good points, right? All the places you've been. I've worked here. I've done these great things here. I may share, the kind of the major milestones. When you meet somebody for the first, or you get your new job, and you're kind of introducing yourself, and the people take you out to lunch, and kind of say, "Well, tell us about yourself." And you start to tell why I lived here for a while, and I did this, and my family. I went here with my family. I spent time over here. We talk about all those highlights of our life, right? What does God know? Does He know just the highlights? He knows the simplest things about us, right? He knows us when we sit down, when we stand up. He knows us when we have a hard time getting up. When we have a hard time taking time and sitting down and listening and being and abiding with Him. He knows my sitting down and my uprising. And that second verse, the second part of that verse, we also see He knows our motive. Thou understandest my thought afar off. We talked about that a little bit, about the prideful. Look back in, I think it was verse 6 in Psalm 138. He says, but the Lord be high, though the Lord be high, yet hath He respect unto the lowly, but the proud He knoweth afar off. It's that same idea that He knows our thoughts afar off. He knows our thoughts before we even realize that we're having those thoughts, before those thoughts become manifest into actions and attitudes, right? He says there, thou hast known understandest my thought afar off. You ever been in your thoughts sometimes and not really sure where this is going to take you? Could be anger, could be bitterness, could be happiness, and it's like, what just happened? And you think about it for a second, you realize this is how I feel about it. Sometimes you don't know how you feel about it right away. That's what he's talking about. Before I even understand myself, God already understands me. He already knows those thoughts afar off. Verse 3, He knows my movements. Thou hast compassed my path and my lying down. Thou art acquainted with all my ways. God knows what I'm going to do. He knows me, right? And we'll look at why He knows me. He talks about that a little bit later. But he starts out, he says he knows the ways I'm going to go. He knows the patterns. How many of you drive the same way almost every day? When you came here this morning, you drove the same path that you came from home to church, from work to home. You do those paths all the time. He knows our routines, right? He doesn't need GPS to know where we go every day. Google probably knows where you're at every time too now. But God knew that well before Google did, right? He knows everywhere we go. We can go for a walk, down the same block every day. God's going to be there. And then he says, He compassed my path and my lying down. That means He's there. He's present. And the compass means that He's close. It's not like He's on the watchtower way away like a guard, kind of watching over the prisoners. He's walking next to us, right? He's present with us. He's present next to us. We also see in verse 4, he says, for there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. He knows not just the things we do, but the things we say. He knows our conversation. He knows the things that we say, the words that we speak. He knows them. This is foundational to understand that he's not just this man with the big beard sitting up in the heavens looking down, kind of moving pawn pieces around. That He knows us intimately. He knows the whispers that we make. He knows the things that we mumble under our breath. He knows the things that we shout out loud in our prayers. What does He say about the Holy Spirit? What does the Holy Spirit do for us in our prayers? He intercedes for us. He speaks those things that we can't speak. We don't know how to speak. Remember, there's words. I was listening to a book now about it's kind of the last 20 years of China and its transition. It's called the Age of Ambition. And the word ambition in Chinese, they don't have a word for ambition, but the word in Chinese is translated wild hearts. And you think about that, and it just fascinates me when you think about other cultures and other languages and how we think of ambition. There's good ambition and bad ambition, and but how that's translated in their language is wild hearts. And we think about there's language that we can't even utter. There's thoughts that we have that we can't even utter because we don't have words sometimes to put together. I went to college and tried to learn some words. Rachel knows I use words wrong all the time. But the thought is there, right? I said, you know what I'm thinking though. I don't have to say the right word. You know what I'm thinking. But he says there, He knows the words before. O Lord, thou knowest it all together. Look at verse 5. He says, we see that He also knows our maneuvers. Verse 5, thou hast beset me behind and before and laid thine hand upon me. I can't get away from God. Sometimes we try to duck and weave. When you had a toddler, and they're trying to, they want to take off and run after something. What do? They duck and weave, kind of do this movement and try to, they may run around in a circle around you. You try to grab them, right? What's He say? Thou hast beset behind and before, and thou hast laid thy hand upon me. There's nowhere we can go. We can't escape Him, right? When we walk across the street, what do we do with our kids? We hold their hand, right? They can't run out. They can't go off in some direction that I wouldn't know about. I know exactly where they're at all times. And that's what he's talking about. The idea that I can't put one over on God. right? He knows all the moves. He knows how we try to get away. Let's look at verse 6 and 7. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? We see here is David's exclamation. You see, David had seen that God knew who he was. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? I was thinking about as a manager at work, one of the things we talk about in leadership is knowing your own limitations, knowing your challenges, the things that you're really good at and the things you're really not good at. Why do we try to know some of that stuff? Why is that important in a leader to know your strengths and limitations? You don't want to put your foot in your mouth, yeah. I don't want to say I can do something when I really can't. What else? I know what I need to work on, right? I know the areas that does not say I'm not really good at that. I'm not good at keeping the books. I don't need to keep the books, right? I don't need to worry about numbers if I'm not good at it. If I'm a man, if I'm in charge, I have to be responsible for that, right? So I've got to work on that. I've got to develop in that area. I've got to grow in that area. So I think about that when I think about this verse when he says, I can't understand it, that he knows everything about me. I can't attain into it. Sometimes we try to better ourselves by knowing as much as we can about ourselves, knowing where our weaknesses and where our strengths are. But guess who knows how to better ourselves before we even know how to better ourselves? God does. God knows the areas that we need to grow in, the spiritual areas that we need to grow in. So in verse, we see that as a leader, he's the one that knows the places that we need to develop. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain into it. It's impossible for me to comprehend what God knows about me. It's funny, we talk about it in work, and we talk about performance management and getting to know how to help our employees become better employees and managers become better managers. And we get feedback from each other, right, from different leaders in the organization. Hey, how am I doing? Do we do good on that project? What do we need to change that? But that idea that we can get input from others. We don't even have to get input from ourselves. I can ask, hey, Rachel, how am I doing? Yeah, and as a father. And she knows a lot about me. She can see things that I don't see. But guess what? God sees even more. There's no one. I mean, I'm just trying to get you to comprehend for a minute how much we think we know about ourselves, or what people may know about ourselves we may not realize, but God knows even more. And God knows not just so that He knows like, oh, I knew that was going to happen, but He knows so that He can care for us, that He can attend to us, that He can help us grow and help us become more like Him. Let's look at verse 7, chapter 1, or Psalm 139, verse 7, verse 8. So we see His omniscience, the study and the truth. It's impossible for us to understand that knowledge. We see the second kind of study that David looks at, and we look at His omnipresence in verse 7. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the light shineth as the day. The darkness as the light, and the light are both like unto thee, or both alike to thee. Actually, I missed one passage, and we talked about our motive back in verse 2, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 25. I want to point this out because who's David talking about in Psalm 139? What part of the Godhead is he talking about? He's talking about God the Father, right? Because he didn't know Christ yet. He didn't personally. Matthew chapter 12, verse 25. The Pharisees were talking about him casting out devils and saying that he was of Beelzebub. And what did it say about Christ? What did Christ know? He says he knew their thoughts, right? We think about who's David talking about, who has that power? God has that power. So we see in Matthew, who has that power? Christ has that power. So you talk about who God is. It's a reflection of who God. Christ was God, reflected in that. No one else that we know of in the Bible knew the thoughts of others. We do mind tricks and magicians do those kind of things, but Christ knew their thoughts. He knew their intents before they even spoke it. So look at verse 7. We'll look at his omnipotence. Whither shall I go? We look at whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? This idea of that God is already there, that God is not bound by time or space, or by knowledge or space. We'll look at in time in this as well. He says, if I ascend unto heaven, thou art there. If I make thy bed in hell, behold, thou art there. The idea that he's not hid, we're not hid by death. Death cannot hide us, right? Just because we die and people think we can escape God through death, we can't. God is already there. He's been to heaven. He's there in hell. Some people feel that I'd rather die and go to hell because then it's going to be a party for me. And do whatever I want. I don't have to be in heaven with God and deal with all that religious stuff. I can just do whatever I want in hell. What's he say here? God is already there. God's holiness is already there. That you can't escape that. We see in verse 8. If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. And we know then that's the hope that we look for, is to ascend into heaven and be in his presence. What do we get to do when we're in his presence? Behold him and see his glory, or behold his glory, understand his glory, be in his presence. But he says, if I make my bed in hell, and it's interesting, he says, I make my bed in hell. That was a choice, right? Ascending up into heaven, he didn't choose to ascend. I mean, it wasn't something that he's like, if I choose to ascend up into heaven. He says, but what? If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. We think of the lowest of the low. The person that's made the worst choices in all their life. They've rejected God. They've just said, there is no God. There's no possibility. What's he say? Is God there? Does God see them? Yes, absolutely. God sees them. God sees their soul and cares for their soul. We keep going. He says in verse 9, so we see we're not hid by death. In verse 9, in 10, we see we're not hid by distance. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. We think of the sea. We know a lot about space, and we've sent stuff up into space. We know only a portion of what the sea is like and what's at the very bottom of the sea. Only a few machines that we've ever taken down, submarines that we've taken down to the deepest depths of the sea. But he says, what's he say there? Even in verse 9, if I take the wings and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. If I'm in a submarine at the very bottom of the sea, is God there? Absolutely. There's no light at the very bottom of the sea. You realize that light can't pass all the way down to the bottom of the sea. Strange. Have you ever seen, Rachel taught marine science for 15 years, so I've seen plenty of marine science videos, and seeing the stuff that lives at the bottom of the sea. It looks like alien creatures. They don't look like they're from Earth, right? They got these clear fish and these things that glow and these things with these strange eyes and these teeth and all sorts of things. It looks like a totally different world, but guess what? God is there. God created all of that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but God created all that. Every little piece that doesn't even look like it would belong here, God is there. We see in verse, the idea he says there, even if there's, in verse 10, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. That verse there, the idea of hold me, has the idea of snatching up. Like he'll catch me. He'll make sure I don't fall, that I don't sink. Who is someone that we can think of when we think of the uttermost parts of the sea? That no matter how far he tried to go, he couldn't get anywhere. Jonah. We think of Jonah. Jonah tried to run as far as he could from God, didn't he? He thought, and he was a prophet, which I think is amazing to me. That as a prophet, he thought I could get as far away from God as possible. If I go in the opposite direction of Nineveh, God won't be there. Or he'll forget about me at some point because I'll be so far away, I'm out of sight, out of mind, right? What happened to Jonah? We know what happened. He got snatched up, right? God held on to him and brought him back, and so that he can complete what God had told him to do. So we see that no matter how far we go, God is there. His presence, we can't escape his presence. We see in verse 11 and 12, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day, and the darkness and the night are both alike unto thee. The idea that it's God doesn't need light to see us. And it seems kind of odd if you think about it, that here he talks about death, he talks about distance, and he talks about something as simple as darkness. But it's amazing to me that people still believe that, that darkness hides God. Hides them from God, I should say. I wasn't alive. My birthday goes to 1980, so I wasn't here in 1977 when there was rolling blackouts in New York, and there was some rioting that happened where the lights went out and there were riots that came out, or people started rioting because they thought the darkness would hide their crimes. We were in St. Croix last summer, and they were talking about when the hurricane came through, and after several days of not being able to get supplies and things, people started rioting. And we were in a cab ride actually, and the cab driver and the lady that he had picked up, it was a shared cab, were talking about the island and that, and they got debating because he was like, well, you shouldn't have stolen stuff from the store, and she's like, well, I only took a phone and I only needed it, and it's like they started this debate about what was right and what was wrong in those riots. But they felt like because there was no presence, there was no police presence, there was no authority, that it was okay. So at least the lady did. The cab driver was kind of the voice of righteousness in that sense. It was kind of fun. It was actually entertaining to listen to. But oftentimes it's not just the presence of physical darkness that we feel that we get away from God. Sometimes we feel spiritual darkness around us. And we think, it's too dark. There's just not enough spiritual light around us. There's not enough Christians around me, so it's okay. And do whatever I want now. Or I'm just going to give up and do whatever I want. Sometimes it's political darkness. Times are just too tough. There's too many restrictions against us. We can't speak what God has told us to speak, so I'm just not going to speak it anymore. What's he say? No matter in the darkness is just as the light. We think of John chapter 3. Go ahead and turn there. John chapter 3 and verse 17. We see Christ spoke this principle. John chapter 3, and y'all should be able to quote it. Obviously, 3:16, for God so loved the world, and he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they were wrought in God. The idea that here he says that men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. I was telling somebody before, nothing really good ever happens after 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. So very few times have I ever stayed up and not gotten in trouble after 11 or 12 o'clock, or found some kind of mischief, or friends have gotten in mischief after 11, 12 o'clock at night. The idea that we shouldn't love darkness, we should love the light. We should love to see, to show God's light in our lives. And that we can't hide in the darkness away from God. Look at verse 13. So we see his omnipresence. God is there. And that's a hard one to imagine, because we see God as a person. Again, he's not that man up in the sky looking down on us. He's there. He's with us. He's walking with us wherever we're at. If we walk in the darkest valley, he's with us. If we walk the farthest away to the distant land, he's with us. If we go to the verge of death, he's with us. Let's look at his omnipotence in verse 13. He said, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members are written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. How precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I could count them, they are more in number than in the sand. And when I awake, I am still with thee." All right, so we see here, this is a fundamental passage when it comes to understanding pro-life perspective, right? Because what's he talking about here? What's he talking about? God's omnipotence. He's talking about his ability to create me. This is going to be, we'll talk about this for a minute, but this is going to be a hard one to fathom for a minute, because God has created us. And we'll talk about some numbers here. I'm actually going to read a passage from this John Phillips. I was trying to find a better way to say this, but I want you to think about what it means when he says there in verse 13, "Thou hast possessed my reins, you cover me in my mother's womb. I'll praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." Think of this for a minute. So if you've got to look on your Bible there, you might have an O that's on there. You see an O on your page? Just to look at it for size. You see an O on your page. That page, that O on that page, if you think of the microscopic cells that make our bodies, that would be about 30 to 40,000 cells in just that O. Okay? So think of that O and think of the number of cells that would fit within that O. 30 to 40,000. Each microscopic cell is a world in itself containing an estimated 200 trillion tiny molecules of atoms. Each cell, in other words, is a micro-universe of almost unbelievable complexity. All these cells put together make up a living creature. So think about this. This is what God has wrought. When he says he has wrought it in the deepest parts of the earth, the idea that he has created us out of these tiny molecules, these tiny atoms, trillions of them, making up those cells, the tens of thousands of cells. Each cell has its own specialized function, and each works with an intricate timetable which tells it when to grow, when to divide, when to make chemicals, and when to die. Every minute of every day, some 3 billion cells in the body die, and the same number are created to take their place. Think about that. 3 billion cells in your body died today, and 3 billion cells in your body were created today. That's hard for me to even fathom. We think of those numbers of what goes on because we live our lives every day and we don't think about the intricacies of God's creation within us. We think about what it takes. Take for a second where you're sitting right now and just think about your breathing. How it doesn't take a whole lot for you to breathe. You didn't have to think about it before I said it, right? You were already doing it because we obviously know because you're here. Most of your eyes are still open, so we're still good. But the idea, you don't have to think about that stuff. God has made your body, so it's good that we've got these cells that move, and he says there he wrought them. He knitted it all together is what it literally means in there. He says each cell has its own specialized function, and every minute of every day, some 3 billion cells come and go. During any given moment of life of any one of these cells, thousands of events are taking place, each one precisely coordinated at the molecular level by countless triggers. The human body has more than 1,000,000 billion of them, 1,000,000 in each square inch of skin, 30 billion in the brain, billions of red blood cells in the veins. Obviously, such a complicated and unerring development of cells cannot possibly be the example of chance. He created me, David exclaimed. Think about this. David's awe. Think what time of life that David was in. Did David have a lot of science back then? How many microscopes did David look in his lifetime? None, right? We think about David's understanding of the human body, of the development of a baby, of a fetus, as they would call it. We try to call it today, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The idea of development of a baby. How sophisticated was David's understanding of child development? None, really. He may have seen, a child that didn't survive, or may have seen some impacts, but he didn't understand how all that worked. But guess what? He had awe because of it. And as we understand science and we understand what it really means for those cells to work, we just described how those cells work and the DNA and genetics and all those things and how intricately perfect they have to be to work for us to live and to function. We should be even more in awe of who God is. He says there, this idea that there's a preciousness to life. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. The idea that that we cannot, that life is precious. Rachel and I were talking. This is why I can't run for office, I've decided. It's because of the issue around abortion and life. And when does life become defined? He says there, thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. As we think about being made, we talk about when a baby is born, what do we look for? Traditionally, what do we say we look for? 10 fingers, 10 toes, perfectly made, and how beautiful the baby is. We think of that development. But God didn't just see, he didn't see a fetus, as we try to use the term today. And I know it's an uncomfortable term because people use it to excuse, to justify abortion and so forth. But he says there, what did he see? He says, thine eyes did see what? What's that word there? He says, mine eyes did see my substance. God knew who I was before I was me. God saw me as a person from the very beginning. I was telling Rachel, you think about if one of you didn't have a heartbeat for a week, what would we declare you? Dead, right? The baby has a heartbeat within the first 5-8 weeks. The sign of a heartbeat, of a pulse. Why is that not life? We think about this idea. It's easy to take away the substance of that baby and call it a fetus, or call it something else. Call it something that's just growing, a bunch of cells that are growing. But when we see the substance of that baby is a life. It's a person. That's what David understood. He says there, my substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secretly and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. The idea that curiously wrought is the idea of embroidery. I think my mom used to do cross stitch and embroidery in that. And what does an embroiderer do? They just kind of like, let me just kind of, it's not quite like knitting. Knitting, people get into that rhythm and they can do that. And I'm not, that's a complicating thing. I won't even make light of that because I won't even try to do that. But if you're embroidering, what do? You pay really close to every stitch. When you think about it, that's what God did for me. That's what God did for you. He paid close attention to every stitch, every cell, every molecule, making sure it was put together in the right place. We think about, this is the God of glory. Go back. Who was this God? We saw it in Psalm 38. It was the God that was worth all glory. The God that was powerful. That's why we watched This Is My King. The one that we can't even comprehend. He's indescribable. Yet he pays attention to every little part of me to know who my substance is. We're not going to finish this one because I want to spend some time on the second part of David's request. We'll finish up next week. But I want you to think about that. David was in awe of the power of God. He says there in verse 17 again, how precious are thy thoughts unto me, O God, how great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. Surely, we'll continue on in verse 19 next time. But he says, if I awake, I am still with thee. That David was in awe of who God was, and he didn't even have an understanding of science. And science wasn't a word that they used back then. But to understand the intricacies and the pieces that make up who we are. Last thing I'll say, I've joked before that when we think of worship, we've looked at in Psalms before about worship, and we talk about what are one of the things that speaks who God is. His creation does, right? So in some ways you could say a scientist is a worship leader, because what does a scientist do? What does science do? It helps us see who God is. How precious God is, and how powerful God is to be able to create something so detailed and so specific. So this idea that God's power is demonstrated not just in the creation about us, not in the great mighty hurricanes or in the avalanche or in the earthquakes, but where is God's power demonstrated? The smallest tiny child being created. And that idea that he has wrought who we are. So think about that this week. Who God is, that he's not a lofty God that's far away, but he's one that knows us intimately. He's the one that knitted us together, and he saw our substance. Next week we'll look at this idea that he considered us, that he knows who we are. He considers us and cares for us. And then we'll see David's request at the end. Any questions? All right, let's close in a word of prayer.